On this episode of Julie Noted, I'm going to take you around different areas of the world and talk about the demographic trends of those regions. Demographics is the study of births, deaths, and population movement. And I've been inspired to talk to you about it because I recently interviewed someone on my show, Timeless, Ken Gronbach, who has been studying demographics for most of his career. And he convinced me that demographics tell you so much about a country's both past, present, and future. On this show, I talk to you a lot about various countries' leaders, new laws that those countries have passed, decisions that their leaders have made, even their weapons and stockpile ammunitions. Those things, though, as important as they are kind of like the external icing or decoration or frosting on a cake. The demographic data tells you what the country is made of, tells you the substance, to use the cake analogy, of the cake. And both things are important. The outside is important, but the real matter, what it's made up of, is certainly crucial too. So I have compiled some newly released data that has been released by Giulio Meotti of the Epoch Times. He's done a really extensive report on this, as well as The Economist, INSEE, which is a demographic database, the World Bank, and other sites which can reveal stark trends that we can see over the next few years that will really dramatically shape the way that our world looks. So let's start here with some hard facts. First, looking at Africa and also Central and Southern Asia. Those areas of the world are booming, and they are Muslim majority parts of the world. In the next 4 minutes, more babies will be born in Nigeria than all of Europe. 3 times as many will be born in India than all of Europe. By 2050, the population of the world is projected to reach 10 billion. That's 2 billion more than we have now. More than half of that increase will be concentrated in just 8 countries: the Congo, Egypt, Ethiopia, India, Nigeria, Pakistan, the Philippines, and Tanzania. So you can see that Africa and Central and Southern Asia are really these hubs of population growth. Nigeria alone will have more inhabitants than both Europe and the United States combined. So we have that part of the world that is booming. But on the other hand, the population in the Western world, that is the United States and especially Europe, is dwindling. American-born population growth here in the United States is on a steady trend downward. The principal driver of population growth, if we see it, is really because of immigrants that are coming to our shores. Actually, in 2020, 1 out of 10 individuals among the electorate were people who were either immigrants or had parents who were not born in this country. Since the year 2000, the population growth of Europe has also been kind of dwindling and actually, in fact, in negative territory, down from nearly 1% annual growth in the 1950s. The HSBC Bank projects that if Europe's slow population growth continues, that their population will be half of what it is now by the year 2070. That means that Europe will lose over 300 million people in just 50 years. In several European countries, we are already seeing these staggering losses. For instance, in Italy, 121,000 fewer students enrolled in school in 2022 than in 2021. And even in 2021, the number was like 90,000. So you can see that it was already big, but it's even growing and growing and growing more. In addition to the dismal Western trends of population, the United States' principal adversaries, that is Russia and China, are also interestingly facing extreme decline. China's population right now is about 1.4 billion people. Actually, India just recently surpassed it by a hair as the most populous country in the world. But that number, the 1.4 billion in China, is expected to halve in the next 40 years. And Russia will lose over 15 million inhabitants by the year 2050. So now that we know these numbers, I like to figure out what is causing these trends. Why are we seeing some parts of the world boom and then other parts of the world slump? Well, I'd like to propose two reasons, and there are many. Policy is one of them, and culture is another. Let's start with the role of policy. China, I just mentioned, their population is going to see probably the rapidest, is that even a word? Rapidest? I'm making it up on the spot. Most rapid, thank you, Sean, change in the shortest amount of time. Their population is going to halve in just a few decades. Why is this? Well, it shows the impact of policy really front and center. It's because of China's one-child policy that Deng Xiaoping, the former leader of China, initiated in 1979. It lasted for 30 years, over 30 years, until the year 2015, when it was revoked. Then China transitioned to a two-child policy. That continued until about 2018. Then a three-child policy. And then now in 2023, China has no formal one or two or three-child policy, but the effects of those policies are on full display. China's population is overwhelmingly old, overwhelmingly over the age of 50, which means that these people are going to continue to age and die out, but there will not be a supplemental younger population to replace that death trend. And even now, we see that this population trend is, even though there aren't as many laws, or there aren't any laws that are forcibly restricting population growth, there are people in China who are less willing to have children because over the past few decades in Chinese history, it's been so the norm to not have many children. So that's China as one principal example of the role of policy in influencing these demographic trends. Let's go to Russia. Russia, like the United States, well, actually not like the United States, like the old United States, the new United States doesn't have forcible conscription, but the old United States did. Russia makes every single male be conscripted, in the army. Well, what has happened recently? Russia invaded Ukraine. In just 1 year, 1 million young men have died in Russia from serving in the forces in this war alone. That is an amazing number because you think, oh, that's just one demographic category. That's just 1 million people who are off the record. No, those 1 million probably also wiped out 2 to 3 million that would be their progeny, that they would procreate. So when you kill people, you not only kill them, but you kill the possible children that they were going to have. That's what makes demographics, among other things, so interesting because you see the cyclical ongoing trend. So Russia's wars have certainly contributed to this demographic trend. You know something else in the policy realm with Russia that's contributed? Alcohol abuse. Russia has historically had a big culture of drinking. In fact, until recently, when Russia realized that this was causing them demographic problems and tried to switch their policies, until recently, Russia was the 4th largest alcohol importer in the world. They have staggeringly high rates of alcoholism among their population. Why? Because it's freezing in Russia. There's not a lot to do. The Soviets and the subsequent non-Soviet government of Russia have alike been very restrictive as far as the movies and TV shows and magazines that everyday citizens can consume. The government has massive overreach into their lives, controlling what they can do for work, the kind of recreational and leisure time they can engage in. But the one outlet that citizens were able to engage in, and indeed it was engineered. The Soviets actually wanted them to drink because it was a way to pacify them. That thing was alcohol. It was a way to pacify the population and to distract them amid all of the dismal bleakness and authoritarianism of the government. Alcoholism leads to a lot of issues. Obviously, overdose. Many people, millions actually, have died of overdoses in Russia pertaining to alcohol. Also, when you abuse alcohol, you are just a diminished person in general. You're not as likely to go out, date, get married, have children. Even if you do have children, you may not raise those children particularly well, and then they may not be best equipped in life to go on and start a family of their own. This alcoholism, according to, again, several databases, has been one of the leading factors in the demographic shifts that we have seen, which is why over the past few years, Russia has instituted some laws in some of the states in Russia that prevent, among other things, public consumption and consumption after a certain time of night. So let's now turn to Europe. We focused on the two adversaries with regard to policy. Let's look at Europe, and then let's look at also why the European population is dwindling as the Muslim populations of Africa and Central and South Asia are booming. Actually, the policy reasons for these two trends go hand in hand. The first and principal one is immigration. There is a trend in Europe that has very lackadaisical, liberal immigration laws, specifically, most especially benefiting the Muslim populations of Africa and of Asia because of its proximity to Europe. So a lot of Muslims in those areas go to Europe because of these open immigration laws, and also because of more economic, educational opportunity for themselves and their children. So we are seeing those populations not only move into Europe, but actually outpace Europeans in terms of demographic growth. Well, what has started this? Principally, the European Union. The European Union is a group of 27 countries in Europe. It's basically kind of the entire continent, and they have political and economic agreements that make it very easy for members to go from one country to another. There aren't very restrictive immigration or passport regulations to work in those countries. And what it has done in turn is that inside the EU, it's very easy for members to move around, but it has also made it the case that people outside the EU, because there aren't as strict border laws, can very easily A, sneak in, or B, in a quick way, legally come to the country. This trend really started in the 1990s. And George Soros's Open Society Foundation, among other liberal institutions funded by wealthy billionaires, have been instrumental in pushing these population trends. The Open Society Foundation of Mr. Soros provides financial support for immigration to Western countries, specifically for Muslim immigration to Western countries. These foundations lobby to the European Union and to other legislative bodies in order to make immigration more accessible for individuals that don't live in that area of the world. So there have been many laws that have been passed that immigration should seek to provide equal treatment of people on racial and ethnic grounds, not discriminate on the basis of religion or skin color for those who are entering the European Union, as well as instituting individuals' right to full family reunification. We see that happening here in the United States. It's also happening in Europe. People will send in their children, and then under the statutes which affirm the right to familial reunification, then those adults get to come into the country too. This has created really stark demographic trends. Allow me to read you some stats. In France today, 26% of the population aged 0 to 4 is of non-European origin. 17% of the population aged 18 to 24. So these are young people who are going to have kids one day, probably very soon. 17% of those aged 18 to 24 are of non-European origin. And 18% of those aged 40 to 44, this is according to INSEE, are of non-European origin. So this is in France. A quarter of people aged 0 to 4 in France are not French. That is going to drastically impact what France looks like in the next 30 to 40 years. Also, this is the case in Germany. 22 million people, or more than a quarter of the German population, are from another country or have parents who are from another country. According to George Soros's Open Society Foundation, which I just mentioned to you, there are also many cities in Europe that actually have become majority Muslim. In 2011, the Open Society Foundation said that Marseille, which is the second largest city in France, was between 30 and 40% Muslim. Now, Marseille, that's what I said. He just heard me wrong. Now, apparently, Marseille is over 50% Muslim majority. This is the case in Melilla in Spain, one of the biggest cities in Spain. It is over 50% Muslim population. In the EU, as an entire conglomeration, Western women in the EU produce on average 1.4 children. But each Muslim woman in the EU produces 3.5 children. So Muslim women are producing 2 to 3 times the amount of children as Western women are producing in the EU. Accordingly, by 2050, 1/3 of the European Union is expected to be Muslim. It shows you how much policy influences demographic trends. It's really amazing, isn't it? And that's why you see people like the new Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, or the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, come out with these really, really strong stances on immigration. Both of those individuals who I mentioned to you have said that they want to restrict the immigration in their own countries and reaffirm family procreation values so that these countries do not fulfill the expected prophecy of having a dwindling population in the near future. So that's the role of policy. Let's go to the role of culture. And of course, culture and policy go hand in hand with one another. I mentioned the one-child policy in China. Reggie Littlejohn, who is a woman here in the United States who is very committed to helping victims of the one-child policy in China, I had her on my show Timeless, and she said that there are many individuals now in China who are afraid to have children because A, of the trauma that they endured over the past few decades under the one-child policy. There was a lot of infanticide because if families could only have one child, they wanted it to be a boy because boys carry on the family name. Boys also have more economic opportunities. So many girls were killed, massacred, aborted forcibly by the government, 8 months in the womb. This in turn, even though the policy has been overturned, it has left some cultural remnants of fear and not wanting to get pregnant for fear that the government may intervene and maybe one day go back with the one-child policy. China is actually trying to subsidize IVF for its citizens because they have such a stark demographic issue, but it appears that these efforts are not enough. Let's look at the Muslim world. Africa, Central and South Asia, most of these countries that I mentioned that are growing hugely are Muslim majority. Fertility, procreation, and starting a family are highly prized virtues in the Quran and in Muslim life. Indeed, specifically, the fertility of a woman says a lot in the Quran about that woman's worth and utility to society. So there's that. Just as a value, procreating is way more affirmed in the Muslim world. Additionally, as you would know from listening to Islam 101 and Islam 101 Part 2 on my show Timeless, there is a desire among Muslim countries to reestablish the caliphate. A caliphate was essentially led by a caliph. The first caliph was Abu Bakr, according to the Sunnis, who oversaw all of the Muslim world, was the spiritual leader of all of the countries that the Muslim world has been divided into. Many Muslims don't like that the Muslim world has been divided. They want to all be unified, both geographically and religiously, under this caliphate. And it is a dream to reestablish this caliphate. So already in Muslim society, it's viewed as honoring God to procreate, bring more children, raise them as Muslim. But also because of this desire to get the caliphate back, Muslims, especially in this part of the world, are valuing procreation out of the hopes that this may be achieved. And by the way, the strategy, the demographic strategy is working. I mentioned that India recently overtook China as the most populous country in the world. China has 1.4 billion people. India has like 1.413 billion people. China was very humiliated that India surpassed them, by the way. 20% of India is Muslim. And in the next few decades, that number is supposed to go up to 30 to 40% of India. So India may turn very quickly into a Muslim majority country. Additionally, by 2050, I mentioned that 15 million Russians will be perished. 50% of Russia will actually be Muslim by 2050 because the Russian Orthodox 15 million will die. And so actually, this caliphate may be achieved because now there will be Muslim majority countries in the Middle East, in Northern Africa, and then it will bleed over into that territory of Russia and India. So the role of culture here, the desire to see that geographic unity, cannot be overstated. And the role of culture in Europe and the United States cannot be overstated. If you look at the attitudes towards procreation in the Western world, it is much more lackadaisical than it is in the Muslim world, for instance. Look at something like birth control or abortion. Both of those things are legal in the United States and in most European countries. It's pretty easy to get access to contraceptive devices in those parts of the world. This is not true in the Muslim part of the world. Pakistan is one of the countries that does allow contraception. About 30% of people in Pakistan use birth control, but in Iran, it is totally illegal. No form of birth control, no form of abortion. In Iraq, abortion is legal, but some limited state-approved contraception is allowed. And in Saudi Arabia, one of the most populous Middle Eastern states, all forms of contraception are banned. Again, super different from the situation in Europe and the United States. According to the National Center for Family and Marriage Research, the United States marriage rate has declined by 60% over the past 50 years. And one of the reasons that this national center attributes to this change is the lackadaisical cultural norms about marriage and about childbearing. Marriage is kind of seen as an old, antiquated institution. Why do you need this piece of paper to affirm one's love for one another? Well, the reason why you need the piece of paper is because a lot of the times the piece of paper is correlated with a greater commitment to one another. And thus, when people feel more secure in their partnership, they're more likely to bring children into this world under that partnership. As we have seen marriage decrease, we have also seen births decrease. Not just out of wedlock births, but births in general. It is a myth that the births remain the same. They are in different contexts, but they also dwindle. And we're seeing this new trend, both in the United States and in Europe, where there's this idea that it's irresponsible to bring children into the world based on the problems that afflict society. This is something that actually the New York Times recently did a spread on. That there are about 10 to 20%, which is small, but nevertheless a significant portion of young people in my age range, 20 to 25, who say that for reasons like climate change, racial inequity, wealth inequity, that it would be wrong to bring a child into this world to inherit it. So again, no wonder we are seeing our corners of the world struggle and other corners of the world proliferate. If you enjoyed this episode, let me know by emailing me at julie@julie-hartman.com. Maybe every once in a while I'll give you some demographic updates as they percolate and become reported on. You can also follow me at Julie R. Hartman on Instagram and Twitter, and I'll see you soon. Take care.